All right, very good. We are recording and going to get posted right now. Full video, but we do have the slides up. Very privileged here to have Vivek Natarajan here with us today. We'll start getting to like the science and the cool stuff in a few minutes, but actually, before we do, you actually have like a really interesting life story. You've gone through a lot of very different experiences and how that's all culminated here. We often find it helpful just to learn more about who we're talking to. Can you just tell us about who you are, where did you grow up, how did you end up where you're doing what you're doing right now?
Yeah, thanks so much, John, for having me over here, and it's a privilege to be over here talking about exciting stuff happening in North America. So, should I close this door? Or?
Sure. Don't worry. Yeah.
You probably might want to speak up.
Yeah, because there's an overhead microphone trying to listen to you as well. Go ahead.
So, yeah, about me, I like to call myself a product of like the MOOC revolution. Massive open online courses. That's because my undergraduate degree back in the day, I don't want to date myself, so not doing that, but was in hardware engineering, and I knew next to nothing about AI. But one fine day while browsing the internet back in my undergraduate university on whatever little bandwidth I could get access to, I stumbled onto Professor Andrewing and Professor Daphne Kohler's machine learning course on Coursera. I think that changed my life. I completely got hooked onto this topic in AI and the idea of building machines that can learn from experience. And I think in many ways, my life can be described as a perpetual journey to do everything I can to learn about AI and work in AI as much as possible. So the reason I bring that up is education is, I think, very important. And as we made progress with technology in general, we've managed to democratize access to world-class education to billions of people worldwide, and put like the world's best teachers at the fingertips of anyone, literally, in like rural village in India or in Bangladesh or in Africa and so on. And I think that has changed lives and allowed people to move through the social ladder and hierarchy. But then I think another equally important part of people's life is healthcare, and that's also deeply personal. But unfortunately, I think the story over there has not been as broken. And so, again, I grew up in different parts of India, and there are certain parts where, for example, for people in some of the nearby towns and villages, going to see a doctor was simply not an option. And so, people often had to walk 30, 40 miles in extreme heat, or give up on a day's wages, or go without food. And so I kind of knew people who had actually never seen a doctor in their entire lifetimes. And so that was something I always wanted to do something about. And in fact, an interesting anecdote is I used to live in the eastern part of the country in India, and I used to take a train journey, a 36-hour train journey to the southern part of the country. There used to be these cabins, and 8 people used to be in those cabins. And I would say roughly 6 out of 8 people in those cabins were people who were actually seeking healthcare. And so these would not just be, people from like the big affluent cities like Calcutta, where I was from, but also from people coming over from Bangladesh or Nepal or Bhutan. And so it always felt like, it should not be so troublesome for people to have access to good healthcare. And so that was something I always wanted to do something about. And so my undergraduate thesis was based on an app called Ask a Doctor Anytime, Anywhere. And so it kind of described exactly what we were trying to do, built using a lot of old school machine learning technologies, a lot of expert systems and rules. It was kind of a very simple symptom checker followed by a diagnosis. And it did not work well because machine learning was not as advanced as it is today. But I'm delighted to say
there were lots of very great successes from that. So I think that's really misleading people.
Success from
lots of positive results.
Back then it was very good. I think now I'm delighted to say that the arc of progress in AI and LLMs in particular in the last year or so, I think it kind of allows us to dream of that future again, where you can have a world-class AI doctor in the pocket of billions of people worldwide, and democratize access to world-class healthcare to billions. And I think so that's what we are building towards, and that's what I want to talk about today in this. And there've been, I think, a few works over the last year which I think are important milestones towards that future. So yeah, that's about me.
Fantastic. But just take it away from people online. If you want to drop in questions in the Q&A, but unless you want us to, we'll try to avoid interrupting, and then we'll hopefully have.
I think that'd be great if you keep it interactive.
Fair enough. Yeah. You can't stop Pat Langley anyway, but just as we go through.
Yeah. So I kind of gave a brief interlude. And so it was, I think, around this time last year when we maybe a bit more than that. We're generally looking at all the advances in foundation models and large language models. And me and my teammate Alan, who's been my chief collaborator on these projects, we had gotten access to PaLM, and we were looking at like the capabilities of that system. And PaLM is path-based language models, Google's version of GPT-4, if you want to call it that way. And it was very clear that this was going to be a new research frontier. And if I were to say that like we were the first people to think about applying LLMs to biomedicine, then I would obviously be lying to you. There's been a rich history, and especially since Transformers came about, there's been a lot of work from different groups, both in academia and in the industry as well. But I think every time there's a new research frontier, the contributions that are maybe more, that survive the test of time are not around like modeling or architecture changes, but mostly around evaluation and metrics and how you measure things. And so this is what we were discussing about. We were noting over those as in Mountain View, and we were thinking, okay, how do we measure progress over here? What are the metrics that we want to capture? What is a good benchmark for assessing the utility of large language models in medicine? And then once you have those metrics, then you can think about optimizing them in ways that are beneficial to patients and aligning them with the values of medicine and care. So that was the key question that we had. And so we decided to then, focus on this very specific task of medical question answering as a good task for assessing large language models and their capabilities and their utilities. And the reason for doing this is very simple. This has been a long-standing grand challenge in AI. And so here I'm showing an example of a research proposal from some very esteemed researchers in the field. This dates back to 1986. About building a medical question answering system for clinical decision support. So people have been, at this problem for a long period of time. It attracts a lot of smart people because, if you get this right, if you solve this problem, obviously it can have a lot of impact in the world. And then the other reason, I guess, this is interesting is because this is actually also quite hard. Like building AI systems that can answer medical questions, that's quite a complex challenge because this involves a combination of reading comprehension and the ability to understand natural language and clinical terms and beyond. It also requires recall and retrieval of appropriate medical knowledge, and then manipulating them and combining them and reasoning them to come up with the final diagnosis or answer that is necessary in these settings. And then the second thing is question answering is very general, and it can subsume many different application scenarios. And so it could, for example, anything could be framed as a question followed by an answer or an instruction followed by an answer. And so this could include things like, asking for diagnosis or treatment plans or like triaging, but it could also include things like, just summarize this note or this case record for me. And so everything could be framed as a question and an answer. So it's a very general thing. So that is why we decided to focus on these tasks to assess the progress in LLMs and assess the knowledge encoded in LLMs. But then again, as I just alluded to, it has, there are like a lot of different application settings or domains which can be framed as questions and answers. And when we were looking at the literature again, we found like a lot of work from different researchers, especially from Dina Demner-Feuchtman and the National Library of Medicine for several years, putting together various benchmarks, medical question answering benchmarks. So we decided, instead of just evaluating on one task or one data set, we should combine and bring all of them together. And so that is what we did. And so we put together this benchmark called Multi-Med QA. It spanned mostly a lot of open source data sets. And that included questions which span professional medicine, such as representative of US medical license exam questions or Indian medical entrance exam questions. But it also includes questions such as those about like PubMed research articles and beyond. And then one important application area for such LLMs could be users seeking medical advice or medical information. And so that felt like a very important area to assess these models. And so we again put together a few data sets that had that. But we also figured out that we are working at a place like Google where a lot of users actually come online with health queries and health information needs. And so we had a very good opportunity to also create and contribute a new data set. And so that's what we ended up doing. And so we had an additional data set that we added to this benchmark, which we called Health Search QA. So that was the benchmark that we used over here. Now that we have the task and the benchmark, the next question is, okay, how do we assess these models?
Could you tell us give one example of what the training data looked like?
Yes, so here's an example. So on the left, you see a couple of examples from these consumer QA benchmarks. And so Health Search QA is basically curated via Google. So it's basically questions that people ask about medical information online about like diseases, symptoms, and diagnosis and beyond. And so you can see a few examples, very short questions. LifeQA is a very similar one, but it was collected at the National Library of Medicine by Dina Demner-Fushman, and the data set also provided reference answers that were curated by librarians. And so that gave us a good reference to assess and compare our models. And then on the extreme right, you see an example of a USMLE style question. And so you see over there, it's a case vignette with description of the patient, their symptoms, the conditions and the lab tests. And then the final task over here is to come up with like an appropriate diagnosis through a process of using logic and deduction and elimination. So it's a multiple choice setting over here. So you can see that these question and answers are quite varied. Some of them are multiple choice, some of them are long form. And so it gave us a very, I would say, a holistic and a comprehensive benchmark versus these large language models capabilities.
These all publicly available. I've tried to do some of this before, but I couldn't get past some copyright issues, or like there are repositories of this, or like who released this for what purpose?
So these were, so different groups put this together, but we have, I can point you to something where we have actually just brought all of them together as a unified resource. But yeah, the credit goes to a lot of different people. So yeah, those are some examples. So once you have the task and the benchmark, then the next question is obviously how do you assess and evaluate? And I think we as machine learning researchers, we like to have metrics that we can very quickly assess the models and make progress. And so things like, on TensorFlow or on TensorBoard that you can very quickly evaluate and see. And so for natural language processing, these are typically metrics like blue or cider, depending on energy task or whatever that you're using. But it turns out that these metrics can often be misleading and can be they can be divergent from reality and actual utility in real world clinical workflows. And so what you need is more deeper and more comprehensive evaluation. And so that is where again we focused on. So again, this was inspired by some work from a bunch of researchers at Stanford, and they had put together a similar rubric, and we decided to expand on that. And we use that to assess the responses from the LLMs that we had. And so especially for the longer responses that we had. And so these include aspects such as scientific consensus, or put another way, this is just looking at the hallucinations from the model. But then also aspects around like extent or likelihood of possible harm, possibility of bias. But then we also wanted to look at things like is the model interpreting the question correctly? Is it comprehending the question correctly? Is it able to reason properly? Is it able to recall the right knowledge? And so we wanted to have like a multifactorial evaluation over here. And so we had this very comprehensive access that we had, set of axes that we had over here.
So in the scientific consensus, the category I don't see is that there isn't medical consensus or there's multiple biases in the elements. Do you handle situations where it's bifurcated in terms of the consensus?
Yeah, we try to make a best guess over here. And again, the evaluations were done by a panel of physicians sourced from like different geographies with different backgrounds with different specialties. So that kind of helped us, ride a little bit over the potential variance over here of the interpretation over here. But then again, it's not perfect, but it is going somewhere. But I completely agree with you. There can be again like variations in interpretation or what is even consensus over here, and that can even change over time. Yeah.
You have any examples?
Yes.
Let's move on. And as I just mentioned, so this evaluation was done by expert clinicians that we recruited from different geographies, namely UK, US, and India. They were all like board certified physicians, and they had like certain minimum number of years of experience, and they were coming from different backgrounds and specialties. But then the other thing is we also realized that the users of these systems could be non-expert lay people. And I think one of the interesting quotes that I've had or heard about LLM is from Zach Kahn at Harvard Med. And he mentioned that LLMs, if you are very smart, then they are a very capable tool for you. But then if you're not very smart or are not an expert, then they can lead you down the wrong path. And so if like a person is a non-expert, it's very easy to be fooled by the verbose answer of a GPT-4 or a MedFarm model and just be tricked by it. And so that's something we also wanted to capture. But again, we realized that non-experts are not the right people to talk about hallucinations or agreement with scientific and clinical consensus. And so what we wanted to maybe assess from them and where we would get like more accurate signals are around helpfulness and utility. And so we kind of wanted to know whether the model was directly addressing their intent and being helpful to them or not. And so these were the two axes that we tried to capture. And again, these non-expert lay users came from a bunch of different geographies. And so it was like a panel rating over here. So I talked about the task, the benchmark, and the evaluation framework. And so now I guess it's the fun part about the modeling. So we were, again, as I mentioned, very fortunate to have access to the pathways large language model at Google. And at that time, I think even today, it's still the largest densely activated decoder on the LLM that has been publicly announced, with over 540 billion parameters. And it's been trained using pathways, which I like to call as a real multi-group engineering. It's a very large scale ML orchestration system at Google that allows you to train very giant large transformer models over tens of thousands of GPU chips, basically. And so the question that we had was, I mean, this model has been trained on internet scale data, and internet scale data already has a lot of medical knowledge, even though the quality of it is kind of like questionable. But we wanted to see, okay, like, can we assess these models and look at their performance out of the box on these different questions? And so that's what we've set out to do. And we, since we were using known benchmarks, we also knew where the overall state of the art was in the community. And so, to our surprise, a version of the PaLM model that we use, which we call Flan PaLM, it's basically an instruction-tuned variant, and so it actually performs even better. Turned out that model was remarkably good even out of the box. And so just with like, a combination of simple prompting techniques, that model reached a performance of 67.6% on this MetQA USMLE representative question data set. And so just to put that into perspective, typically the passing score on these USMLE style questions is around 60%. And so this was kind of the first system that cleared that benchmark by a significant margin. And before then, there have been obviously a lot of groups, including in industry and academia, have been working on this, but the average accuracy was tapering around at like 50%. And so it was quite heartening to see this progress that out of the box, without any optimizations, this thing was working really, really well. And that was very promising.
I can't tell what the points on this curve are. Are those different systems and yours is the last? Or?
Yeah, so those are all different systems. And so, and then the y-axis is the accuracy. And so you can see this big jump going from the last one, PubMed GPT to Flan PaLM.
I'm not sure it's what you're gonna describe anyway, but like, what's the evolution? Is it just larger models, or like someone's doing some deliberate engineering to try to make it better at medical questions?
Yeah, so that is what I'll get to right now. Obviously, the fact that when you're training on internet scale data means that these systems learn about a lot of different topics, and that's not just medicine, but also like aspects like physics and medicine, law or biology and beyond. And so these models are generally knowledgeable about them. And so anyone who's played around with ChatGPT or GPT-4 or with Bard or with PaLM, they would know this. These models are very good. So I think that is great news for us. And maybe another related question over here is, as John just mentioned, like what is the impact of scaling? Does it make things better? And when we looked at the scaling plots over here and analyzed the performance as we scale up the models from 8 billion parameters to 64 billion parameters to 540 billion parameters, we were seeing like an accelerated improvement in performance. And this kind of suggested to us that like, the task.
Accelerated?
Yeah, you can see that.
Technically?
Yeah, it is. The curves are bending upwards.
That's just that velocity.
Right.
Let's just we'll
Keep going.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not a physics major, so I'll take your point on that one. Yeah, so what we were seeing was performance was getting better with scale. And so that kind of suggested to us that medical reasoning is, and okay, I don't want to make this claim right now, it could be pretty strong, but is that an emergent property of these models as you scale this up? And I think the reason for that is, again, as you scale up these models, they have more parameters and they can encode more knowledge, including medical knowledge, without any kind of, they can encode medical knowledge better, let's just say that way. And then also because you have more parameters, you can induce better reasoning algorithms within them to be able to do this well.
Should we be careful about the fact that it was pre-trained on a large amount of data from the internet, and perhaps some of the questions in your evaluation task was actually in the pre-trained data set?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so that is, I think, a key differentiation between our papers and the ones from OpenAI and Microsoft. We actually go back to the pre-training data, we have access to it. And so we can compute overlap over different lengths of n-grams. And so we have this analysis in the paper, but the TLDR is the overlap is there, but it's very small. And if you look at, it's like roughly 10% of the questions where you can say any kind of significant overlap. And then if you look at the performance between the subsets where there is actually overlap and no overlap, there's actually no change in performance. And so that kind of tells us that, that's not a big factor.
And in the fine tuning step, are you, do you have a trained test split of the exact same task that you are performing and you're just fine tuning on the 80% split of the task you're going to be testing on later on?
I'll talk about fine tuning a little bit over here. So in this version of the paper, there wasn't any kind of fine tuning on the meta QA tasks.
I see.
So I'll come back to that over here. So I mean, all this was great, right? I think we observed like very similar performance on other objective benchmarks as well, which included Indian medical entrance exam questions, another data set called PubMed QA. And on all these benchmarks, it was the state-of-the-art performance, and often by a significant margin. And so kind of the question was, okay, that's it? Is it done? I mean, are these models so capable that we can start using them at, different medical applications or as, a replacement for a doctor? And so that was kind of the question that we had. And obviously, when I am asking these questions, it turns out the answer is no, otherwise I would not have a rest of the talk. And I think the key insight that we had was when we did the human evaluations. And so when we looked at the human evaluations in detail, that is where we observed key limitations of these general purpose large language models, such as LLM over here. And when I say general purpose large language models, I mean models that have not been fine-tuned or specialized or aligned to the requirements of the medical domain. And so another example is again like ChatGPT or GPT-4. It doesn't. It may have a lot of medical data in its pre-training corpus, but it hasn't been really aligned with the requirements of the medical domain. And so when we subject these models to like actual human evaluation along the different axes that we have, including agreement with scientific and clinical consensus, extent of possibility and extent of harm and bias and beyond, that is where we see these key gaps. But then the challenge is obviously that when you're working with the medical domain, you don't have enough domain-specific data. I think we can all relate to that. There are different reasons for this, privacy, regulation, and beyond. And so you want to come up with an alignment technique, a specialization technique, a domain adaptation technique that uses very little data. And so in order to do that with LLMs, we were very fortunate that at the point when we were working on this, there was another technique that was being pioneered in Google research at that point of time, which was called prompt tuning. And the way prompt tuning works is it keeps like almost the entirety of the LLM frozen. And then it just learns a small set of additional parameters that you can use to condition and teach the model the nuances of the domain. And so it's a very small number of additional parameters that you learn over here, typically in the order of like a few million compared to multi-billion parameter LLMs that you have. And given that it's only a small number of parameters that you have to learn, it's very data efficient. So you can use a few handcrafted examples, and then you can use your typical methods of gradient descent, and you can learn them. And then, in terms of that, it works remarkably well in practice, and I'll show you the results in a bit.
Does this change the structure of the network?
It's basically a few additional parameters that are
where in the network.
It's at the end, so
At the
it's
top.
yeah.
So sort of like cascade correlation, the old days.
You could say that, yeah. But it's like tokens that you are. It's like additional tokens that you're introducing, and so
Good.
And maybe another analogy to use over here is what we as the previous evaluations have revealed. These models, because of like internet scale trading, they already encode a lot of medical knowledge, and so you don't have to impart any net new knowledge to these models. But rather, what you need to teach these models is how to answer a medical question appropriately, how to convey uncertainty, how to like list out maybe all the different possibilities over here. And so that is what we want to teach these models, how to answer the questions with great degree of factuality and beyond. And so that's what we are trying to teach over here. So we're not imparting any net new knowledge to the model, and that's why we don't need these additional set of parameters or like significant fine tuning.
You may have covered this, but why is it called prompt tuning, and what is prompt parameters? Like, why is that parameters called prompt parameters? Because these are like these small additional tokens that are appended to your hard prompt. So the hard prompt is the instruction that you have to your model, and then you force the model to complete the rest of it. So these are additional set of numbers or vectors that you append in addition to the representation of your prompt that you have, and then you feed that in. And so we call it soft prompts because you don't have like an English language representation of it per se, but they are kind of all in the same space. So you're not necessarily changing any of the structure of the network at all, and you're just passing this prompt parameters along with the only thing that changes is the remaining available context length for you. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the rest of it is all frozen. And so you can learn that specific to each task as well. So you can learn one set of parameters for medical question answering, another set for like maybe summarization or something else, or for a law task or whatever. So it's very easy to learn. In fact, to do this, all we had to do was collect like 100 expert demonstrations from our clinicians, use that to learn these parameters, and we could iterate on it like in a few hours in a collab. And so we could do very fast number of experiments really fast. That's super efficient. Yes.
Sorry, so what was the fine tuning? Like you have examples of skin redness, simvastatin, and splitting a warfarin pill. So did you tell the language model, do not give an answer where you can split a pill, or like what was the fine tuning?
Yeah, so the fine tuning process is just to complete and generate the final answer, but then you were not updating the main parameters of the network, but rather you're just trying to use the prompt parameters to come up with a final answer and use the gradient descent. So, but the fine tuning task itself is the same as the LLM objective, which is the expert prediction and completion task.
Sorry, could you give an example of the prompt parameter?
It's just a small set of additional tokens of X. So you have the prompt over here, right, which is the bolded ones in each box over here.
Yeah.
And you would convert that into some sort of a token or an embedding representation, which is basically a set of numbers. And each token would have like a certain vector size depending on the dimensionality of the embeddings. And so similarly, you'll have a few other additional tokens that correspond to these soft prompts, and you learn them through your gradient descent.
Will you do any more discussion about the prompt parameters? I'd like to ask another question, but I don't want to.
Yeah, you could ask this, right?
Okay.
Because
Does the prompt parameters just narrow the space that's being searched and worked on?
Exactly.
And so is it just the pruning of a large part of the network?
I would like to think so. I think it's a conditioning thing. And so if you were to imagine like the space of the weights or parameters of a large language model as a big library, and then the medical section is like is a particular set of books, then you want the model to be able to focus on that and not use the rest of the garbage knowledge that it might have in its network.
And so if you pass in just the parameters themselves, just the prompt parameters with no additional prompt, have you seen what it does to the network and how it prints it down?
Yeah, so we did a few experiments. It turns out it was obviously producing garbage, but it was more in the realm of like clinical topics or medicine or biology rather than any other thing.
So I can think of it as a filter of pruning.
Yeah. That's what I'm.
It's different than the LoRa from PEP, right? Did you try LoRa as well?
No, we didn't try LoRa because we didn't want to do any sort of end-to-end fine tuning. This is a little more faster.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the model fine tuning or alignment process that we had. And so the question is, okay, the first question is obviously, does that in any way affect the performance on the MCQ benchmarks or the knowledge encoded in the weights of the network? And it turns out it didn't. And so when we looked at this MEDPalm performance, which is the prompt-tuned version of FlanPalm, it turns out it was performing at the same level on the USMLE questions as the FlanPalm model. So it turns out it didn't affect the knowledge encoded in any way at all. But then I think the more interesting question or the results were on this human evaluation axis. And so when we looked at like FlanPalm and its agreement with scientific and clinical consensus, it was roughly scoring at around 62%, and physicians or expert clinicians were scoring at around 93%. But then when we did this alignment process with prompt tuning, that gap to physicians was significantly reduced. And so you can look at MEDPalm performance. It was almost on par with clinicians on this axis over here. So that was, I think, a very strong result. And this was not just on one axis, but rather we observed this on multiple different axes as well. And so another one is the possible extent and likelihood of harm. And again, you can see that FlanPalm, the bars are bigger, more answers were judged as being potentially harmful. And then you can see that with the prompt tuning process over here, the gap to clinicians was getting significantly closed, if not getting even better. So that is the impact of doing this prompt tuning process over here.
So were the departures from consensus in the same domain or different domains?
When you say domain, like it's all in.
Right, but you asked 160 questions, so 5%, right, different from consensus. Were they the same 5% between the model and the clinicians, or were they?
Oh, so you're looking at complementarity.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know about that just yet. I don't think we have done that analysis.
Clarification questions. I think you did a good distinction of what's like FlanPalm and MEDPalm. I was questioning from Alvaro Alvarez. What is Palm? What is this Palm 1 or is it Palm 2 or what's MEDPalm? What's FlanPalm? Just help us
Yeah.
super here. What's
So PaLM is the base model of this large language model that was released in, I think April 2022. And then FlanPaLM is an instruction-tuned variant of PaLM. So that had even better performance on some of these NLP and LLM benchmarks such as Big Bench and Glue, Superglue, and beyond.
But like a general instruction tuning is not optimized for any particular task?
It's not optimized by any task. I think
You
it
just
had,
happen to test it on medical questions.
yeah, we just thought, okay, that model is performing even better. I mean, it had a very big delta on Big Bench, and so we thought that's a better LLM, obviously. And then we evaluated that on these medical questions. And MedPalm is the prompt-tuned version of FlanPalm. I haven't talked about PalM2 and MedPalm2 yet, so I'll come to that. So I guess this is the gist of the results. But maybe one quick thing to point out is while we were obviously getting better than general purpose LLMs, we weren't quite closing the gap to physicians. And so for example, there were axes such as this one, helpfulness and utility, where you can see that clinicians were rated to be like significantly better than the LLM answers over here, even after prompt tuning. And so there still remain work to be done. But I would say that, okay, I mean, we made some technical contributions over here with a data efficient alignment technique with prompt tuning. But I think the key contribution of this work was actually the evaluation rubric that we had, the different axes, and how do you assess and measure.
So you talked about consensus, but what was the inter-rater reliability? Because that's going to put a maximum on how well you can do.
That is all in the paper, so
Okay.
We can talk about that.
But that's not the explanation for this gap that you're saying.
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, that's a good point. It's not. So yeah, so I just wanted to quickly say that I think the key contribution of this work was actually how to measure what metrics to use and how to evaluate LLMs. And so it turns out that was the contribution that Nature also liked. And so this paper was published in Nature last month. But again, as I showed over here, there were gaps with respect to clinicians. And so we were thinking about, okay, can we close this gap and come close to expert level performance on these medical question answering tasks? And so within a span of few months, we were able to then build on top of the new LLM that Google had developed, and that was PaLM2. And so that, again, out of the box was performing very, very well on these medical question answering tasks. And so that was a great base for us. But then also when we were doing this work and we had access to this new model, we also had access to more medical domain data, more question answering data sets. And so it now allowed us to do more end-to-end fine tuning. And so we didn't have to just do prompt tuning over here. And so that again helped. And then the third thing I would say with MedPalm2, which was another, I guess, unique contribution, was we were looking at enabling more system 2 style reasoning in these models. And so that's why we came up with a new technique for prompting, which we like to call ensemble refinement or self-refinement, which is instead of making an LLM generate an answer one shot like system 1 style, you would rather want the LLM to think about all the different reasoning paths or all the possible answers, and then feed that back into the LLM again to come up with a final response. So it's like more deliberate and more system 2 style thinking. And you can do that if you have maybe more computation.
So in the earlier slides, you had a comment about the hazard of the advice, like how would it lead to death if someone followed that, I guess is the way to think of it. So an outlier could be quite extreme. Are you thinking of having that type of feedback where it becomes more conservative in when the advice could lead to a more difficult problem?
Yeah, so do you mean like more like feedback from humans over here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think at least all the publicly, the work that we've announced publicly, we haven't talked about how we actually integrate human feedback into the loop over here. So it's even the self-refinement thing is just making LLM, like using more computations on the LLM side, but there's no RLHF loop over here that we have announced, but that's a good direction generally, yeah. And then the final thing, again, like stressing on evaluations was, to look more closely and deeply into the kind of questions that may propagate medical misinformation, like topics such as mental health or COVID vaccines or obesity and other such things. And so we wanted to clearly understand the performance of these models on those axes and ensure that they were not propagating any misinformation or amplifying biases or whatever. And so
I mean, like whether the vaccines work?
Yeah, I mean, whatever. So we had a bunch of these questions as well into the evaluation for MedPalm2. And so I would say for the MedPalm2 paper, which we pre-printed, I think in April or May, these were the 4 main important contributions. And then maybe one quick other thing that I want to highlight was this time we did a proper side-by-side comparison as well. And so we asked a panel of clinicians to assess which answer they preferred between like a MedPalm answer, a MedPalm 2 answer, and physician-generated answer. So those were the key contributions. And I just explained this self-refinement thing, so I'm not going to go into detail over here, but it's like making the model reason about questions in a more deliberate fashion using more compute if you have access to it. So a more two-step reasoning process rather than just a single one.
Quick question, so for MedPalm 2, it's basically just this self-refinement that's your step up, it's still the 540 billion parameters and includes the information from the prompt tuning from the previous round?
Yeah, so the base model has been switched from PALM to PALM 2. And then instead of doing prompt tuning, we did fine tuning with more medical domain question answering data sets. So it's end-to-end fine tune. And then the other thing on top for the prompting was the self-refinement strategy.
And is this because you were able to, and I don't know if you can, but evaluate, like, because to to go to 540 billion parameters and get a 17% increase in accuracy, like that's a lot of extra information. Then you gained, I don't know, maybe 15 to 25% more adding the prompt tuning from the clinicians.
Yeah.
And so is it, like, can you evaluate that it would be better to add another 540 billion parameters to boost your accuracy, or we should get more clinicians involved, or both? And like, can you weight that? You know, like if you gain so much by adding a few clinicians, and from what I recall from the paper, it's a lot, but it's kind of not a lot of clinicians. It was like 100, less than 100 or something. So, do you feel that in the end it could be like the ultimate device by adding, like, forget about adding parameters, just keep prompt tuning and do this? Or do you have a feel for where you're going with it?
Yeah, I think it comes, so there are two things I would differentiate. One is the capability of the base model, and that is somewhat tied to the number of parameters that are there. But it is, again, that depends on the pre-training corpus that you have as well. And so PALM, for example, was not chinchilla optimal because it was, I think, a much larger model than it needed to be. And so for the same pre-training corpus, you could have a much smaller model as well. And so I'm not going to talk about how much parameters went into PALM 2 because that's not public, but you can imagine that it was chinchilla optimal for the pre-training corpus. And if you're not clear about chinchilla optimal, we can talk about that later. And so that's one thing, the capability of the base model. And that obviously improved from PALM to PALM 2. And then the next thing is obviously the quality of the domain-specific data that you have. And then the third parameter over here that you can play around with is the amount of compute that you have. And so if you don't have a lot of compute, only have a limited amount of data, then using something like prompt tuning will help you get significantly along the way. But then if you have data and if you have compute, then you can do end-to-end fine tuning or use techniques like LoRa that we talked about over here. So it comes down to these factors that you have. So over here, just because now we had compute obviously, and then also a little bit more data, we decided to do end-to-end fine tuning. But I would again say it's not about just simply scaling up these models. Capabilities does not simply come from scaling, but actually comes from a combination of the quality of the pre-training data and then making it chinchilla optimal and beyond. And then once you have that base set of capabilities, then it again comes back down to the quality of the fine-tuning corpus or the domain specialization corpus that you have. Right. So again, the quality matters over there rather than quantity, I would say.
And for those of us who may not have like a computer power that Google does, so it's good to know, like, if you can, like, where can you cut if you need to, because pretty much everyone else would have to.
Yeah, I would say so. I think like if you have like higher quality data, then you can even work with smaller models or use techniques such as prompt tuning over here to overcome the lack of compute. So again, that's also something we like because training big models obviously takes a lot of time, and so we would want to avoid that as much as possible, and also a lot of money. And even Google does not have infinite money. So
Great, thank you.
So those were the key differences between PALM and PALM 2, and then MedPalm and MedPalm 2. So when we looked at the performance again on the USMLE MedQA style questions, previously I mentioned that MedPalm was around 67%. Now with MedPalm 2, we were getting up to 86.5% accuracy. And just to put that into context, 98 percentile test takers on USMLE typically score around 85%. And so this was kind of like getting to expert test taker performance. And I'm very clearly saying this, it's expert test taker and not expert doctor, because passing the USMLE is not the same as being a doctor. Let's be very clear on that one. And then The other, I guess, interesting evaluation was this side-by-side comparison. And so we asked a panel of physicians whether they preferred MedPalm answers or MedPalm 2 answers or physician-generated answers. And I think this was, I guess, more interesting for us because.
Was it blind?
Sorry?
Was it blind?
Yeah. Right. And so we had over 1,000 questions over here. And when we did the study, we found that on 8 of the 9 axes that we had, a panel of physicians actually preferred MedPalm 2 answers over physician-generated answers, and sometimes by a pretty big margin. And so that was clearly showing that we were now no longer just in possible utility territory, but actually going more towards expert level performance, and at least some of the benchmark tasks that we were evaluating over here. And so that is, I guess, the other key contribution of this work. And maybe just to show a qualitative difference between a MedPalm answer and a MedPalm 2 answer. So you can see for this question that like the MedPalm answer is fairly concise, but it's sometimes lacking key details. Whereas on the other hand, the MedPalm 2 answer, you can see that it's more complete, it's more factually answered, and it's less prone to omitting any sort of information, important information over here. So across the board, these were the key factors of improvements that we are observing between MedPalm and MedPalm 2. And then since obviously we put out this work, there's been a lot of media attention on it, and that's great. But I guess it's important that when you have access to technology or when you're building technology that is as capable or as powerful as this one, you need to also innovate in not just a bold manner, but also in a responsible manner. So we decided, okay, we should not be putting this out, completely wildly in the open, but rather we need to do proper assessment. And so we've been working with a number of healthcare institutions, with healthcare providers, with like life sciences companies, and trying to assess whether these models actually fit into their everyday workflows and are helpful to them and useful to them. And we've been collecting feedback, and we made good progress on it. There's been very good feedback over the last few months, and now we hopefully in the next month we'll open up access to MedPalm 2 more broadly to everyone, so that everyone has access to it. So the last few months of testing and iteration has been very helpful in identifying some of the I would say things that were not working well with MedPalm and improving on them. So now we are a little bit more confident, I would say, in terms of their utility generally. So that was MedPalm 2 in a nutshell. The last work I would want to talk about is our most recent one. It's called MedPalm Multimodal. And the reason for this one is, again, very simple. If you look at medicine as an endeavor, it is obviously inherently multimodal. Doctors are, not just talking in language, but they are routinely interpreting records, genomics, imaging data, lab tests, and beyond. And so you want your AI systems to be able to do that as well. There are different ways in which you can build multimodal LLMs. So you could use pre-trained encoders, pre-trained LLMs, and you can craft them together and come up with like a final multimodal model. But in this work, we were a little bit more ambitious, I would say. What we wanted to do was actually, instead of taking this Lego block style approach, we wanted to see if we can train like a single generalist model that can flexibly encode and interpret any biomedical data modality and solve like a broad number of tasks to a high degree of accuracy. And so that was kind of our goal, to see if like the same model with the same set of parameters can it reach like SOTA or near SOTA performance on a bunch of different tasks or not. And so again, one of the challenges with building these models, or when you're taking on like a new research frontier, is obviously the lack of benchmarks or data sets. And so again, so for this, what we needed to do was curate another benchmark. And so to do this, we put together something known as Multi-Med Bench. So it had all the language medical question answering data sets that we had in Multi-Med QA. But in addition to that, we also introduced medical image classification tasks. We introduced radiology report summarization and report generation tasks. We also introduced a genomic task for variant calling. And so in total, it spanned 14 biomedical tasks and 7 different modalities. And it had over 1 million samples for training and evaluation over here. And so that was the benchmark that we used for training and evaluating the MedPalm M model over here. And so similar
at some point, could you say a little more about training test splits and stuff? Because I really don't know how you guys do that these days, but it can wait.
Yeah, or we could, I'll come back. And so similar to how MedPalm and MedPalm 2 were built on Palm and Palm 2, the multimodal variant was built on this multimodal LLM that we had at Google that was actually originally developed for robotics called Palm E. E stands for embodied over here. And the nice thing about PalmE is it's a very flexible architecture and it enables interleaving of tokens from different modalities in a flexible manner. So you can like put language and image and language and image arbitrarily as you want. And so that is very, very useful in medicine because you have so many different modalities that you would want to the model to interpret and encode. And then the other thing is it allows these encoders and the LLM to be trained end to end using whatever tasks or data that you have. And as I just alluded to, what happens is in the process of doing that, you learn a single representation space for all your different modalities. And so language, medical images, genomics, or whatever, EHR or lab records or whatever you have, all those data modality representations all come into the same space over here with this model. And so a bit more on the fine-tuning details over here. So obviously we use the training split to do this of the multi-med bench dataset. About 15% of it was language only, and the rest were all the multimodal tasks that I talked about. Most of these tasks use the instruction tuning one shot with dummy image exemplar, and we'll come back to this in the next slide. And then we had a couple more tasks where we just did zero shot because it kind of worked well out of the box. And so when I say zero shot, it's just an instruction that's provided to the model. And when I say one shot, you can see in this image over here. So for radiology report generation, you have an exemplar of how to solve this task. So you have an instruction which was curated by a radiologist, telling the model very precisely how to interpret a chest X-ray image and come up with like a radiology report. And then we also have an example of a potential report over here. But the key thing to point out over here is the image token. I'm not sure if you're able to see it, but it is in gray over here. And what that signifies is that is a dummy token. For computational reasons, we did not have an actual image in the one-shot exemplar. Rather, we just have a dummy token as a placeholder for the model. And so basically the model did not require an actual multimodal exemplar, but rather it just required an exemplar with a dummy placeholder as to just how to solve the task. And that just helped the model over here. And then once you have that, you can follow that up with the real image, which is indicated in the blue with IMG over here, and then ask the model to generate a report. And then if you had like a more classification task, the way we framed it was as a multiple choice with all the different classes that were integrated. And then we asked the model to come up with a final class over here. And that's the example that we have for dermatology. Any questions on this one? I think
It's interesting to know how you guys found your prompts. You guys, there's like there was a paper published like during the weekend that people use genetic algorithms to find the optimal prompt. Is this just based on prompt tuning, like expert generating the prompt, or what's the?
Yeah, I think for the most part till now, we've been trying to use experts as much as possible.
Okay.
And the reason for doing that is the models that we have are very good at following instructions. And they have very good language capacity. So we believe that if you have an expert crafted prompt, that can go a very long way over here. And that often means just working with your in-house pool of radiologists or clinicians and come up with something. Obviously, you can do all the fancy stuff around like, using genetic algorithms and beyond it. But I think it's much more easier or like much more reliable to use human experts if you have access to them than using machines. But in the future, we don't know. So yeah, and very quickly on the results. So the key thing to point out over here was the baselines that we were comparing to for each of these different tasks were actually specialist models that were trained to perform really, really well on these tasks. And so the state of the art at that point of time for all these different tasks were specialist models that were trained to only perform that given task. And so we then compared our generalist model that can perform all these tasks together at the same time with the same set of model weights. And it turned out that for most of these tasks, either the MedPalm model was near the state of the art or was exceeding the state of the art by a significant margin. I'm not going to go into detailed numbers over here, it's all in the paper, but it was very encouraging for us that we could now train a single model that can, without any sort of customizations, can do multiple different things at the same time. And so that kind of tells us the future direction is to just keep pushing the boundaries of the number of modalities that these models can encode, the number of tasks that they can solve, and hopefully that will lead to ever more increasing general biomedical AI agents. And just to point out the importance of medical domain fine tuning, even in the multimodal setting over here, we compared that with the base PalmE model, and that I think has reasonable amount of medical data, but not a lot, because it was mostly trained on natural images and vision language tasks. You can see that in the extreme right, there's a comparison between PalmE and MedPalmM. And you can see that there's a very, very big delta between MedPalmM performance and PalmE performance. And so PalmE is an example of a generalist model without any medical domain fine tuning. And then you have MedPalmM, which has been fine tuned for the medical domain. And you can see this giant delta over here. So that underscores the importance of doing this. And then again, another key question is again, like around scaling. And I would say that in the multimodal setting, scaling is less clear how beneficial it is. And so I think this is a very good example over here. So you can see that the MedPalm 12 billion model, the report that it has generated has a lot of like errors over here, which are marked in red. But if you look at the quality difference between the MedPalm 84 billion model and the 562 billion model, you actually see that the MedPalm 84B model, that is actually more accurate than the 562B model. And I guess the reason for this is, even though you have a more capable and a language model with more number of parameters with MedPalm 562B, they were using the same vision encoder, and both of them with this WIT 22 billion model over here. And so it turns out that the bottleneck over here for this task, at least for actually the vision representation and not the language capacity or the language capability of the model. And so it turns out that even after you scale the model and improve the language capacity, the performance was staying the same or maybe even slightly decreasing. And so in multimodal settings, I think it's very important to scale up both the vision and the language parts or other multimodal components that you may have equally and comparatively at the same time, instead of like, doing just one or the other. So there are a lot of different knobs that you have to account for and design over here to get this right. And so that's an important component that I would want to point out, that scaling is not very obvious or easy in the multimodal setting. And then maybe the last key result of this work that I would again want to very quickly point out is the point about using language as a scaffold for combinatorial generalization. So given that these models have been trained on a lot of internet scale data, so they kind of know about a lot of these, for example, diseases or pathologies. And so that means that you don't have to you can use the language representations that you have as anchors for learning representations about new data modalities over here. And so what happens is, in this example, what I'm trying to show is the model has never seen an example of a TB image before, like an image annotated with a TB pathology label. But turns out if you give the model a TB image and ask it to describe it, it does a pretty good job of generating a report. And the reason for that it knows the concept of a TB from the internet scale language domain pre-training. And then it has learned image representations that kind of are mapped to words or token representations similar to TB, like other chest X-ray pathologies like pneumonia or whatever. And so it's able to then take this new image and map it to a similar point in the representation space, and then able to do a good job of completion.
You're talking about tuberculosis, not television.
It's tuberculosis, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so it's able to do that well. And so you can, so what we are seeing is now you can use these models as scaffolds for combinatorial generalization over here. So you can have one combination of tasks that you're trained on and one modality you can train on. And then you can use the model at inference time 0 shot to combine with them both together in a 0 shot manner without any fine tuning or whatever. So those are the capabilities that we are seeing emerge in these models. And just to put that into perspective, you can see that a state-of-the-art model uses over 100 examples to come up with like the final accuracy, whereas MedPalm can do that with no training, just 0 shot, and reaches like an accuracy which is very close over here on this task. And okay, so one more final result is, again, you might be wondering, okay, what is the performance on like radiology report generation, compare that to humans? We found that the best MedPalm model was producing, clinically significant errors per report, which was on par with human radiologists from prior studies. So again, it points towards potential clinical utility, but then again, a lot of work needs to be done over here. So those are the key papers that I want to talk about. The final thing I want to maybe very quickly lay out in the remaining minutes is what are we building towards? What is North Star vision over here? And I think, as I alluded to, the North Star is actually building a world-class AI doctor and use that as a trusted aid for millions of clinicians worldwide and put that in the pockets of billions of people worldwide. who are seeking medical information for care. And again, this has a lot of potential applications in care delivery. I'm not going to go into details over here, but they're all equally exciting and they can significantly up-level our clinicians and transform care and the way we do it today. But then I think the other flip side is as you are building this AI doctor and teaching them over different biomedical data modalities, what you're also building on the flip side is actually an AI scientist that can help our researchers understand biology, human disease mechanisms and pathways, and come up with like therapeutics and beyond, and overall ease the burden of diseases. So I'm also equally excited about this aspect over here, where in the process of building an AI doctor, you're also going to get like a world-class AI scientist as well that's going to fundamentally advance our knowledge of biomedicine. And again, a bunch of different potential applications, not going to go into detail over here. And I guess the final thing I want to talk about, I think the technical roadmap over here is also very, very clear. I think we know exactly what to do, which is we have these very strong intelligence substrates that we have with models such as GPT-4 or Gemini or Palm and beyond. But I would again stress that the very important step is necessary over here, which is to actually send these models to medical school, teach them about biology and clinical medicine and different concepts and beyond. Once you do that, you'll have a model that is generally knowledgeable about biomedicine. But then going to medical school is not sufficient. You also need something known as a residency phase where you're actually interacting with humans in the real world and understanding the values of medicine better. And so you need that phase as well. But once you're able to do that, combine a medical school phase and a residency phase, what you will have, or what we hope will end up happening, is a world-class AI doctor and a world-class AI scientist. So that's what we are working on over here. And maybe very quickly, I think the key next problems that need to be solved are things that I've already alluded to, like multimodal medicine, the ability to converse and engage in dialogue and understand language, do proper medical reasoning, but also aspects such as retrieval and grounding that I did not talk about today, and also more work on safety and real-world validation. And then finally, when you're working in the healthcare setting, there's obviously a long tail of problems that are really important, such as privacy and multimodality and beyond. And so we need to address all of them. So I think we have done a good job with these papers of making a breakthrough on the first three set of problems that I've outlined over here, but a lot more work obviously needs to be done in terms of getting towards this AI doctor. And then as we are building out this technology, such a powerful technology, and as this comes to fruition, I think as a society, we need to grapple with a lot of questions over here, questions around safety, trust, equity, like regulation and incentives. I'm not going to go into details over here, but I'm very optimistic that we as a society can grapple with them. And I think if we are able to do that, the future is very exciting. So I will end on that note. And thank you all of you for listening.
Earlier about training test splits. So when we introduced the experimental method in machine learning back in the late 80s, we all realized you don't report results on one training test split. You got to average over different ones. Doesn't have to be cross-validation, but it has to be something. I didn't see any error bars in your studies. Maybe there were some.
There were error bars in all of them.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just explain. So how did you do that? What is the standard now?
We keep the train split the same, and obviously there are things that we can't control.
So you keep a single test training split. So you're not.
No, the train is the same, but the test you can obviously flip around, and you can do bootstrapping or whatever. You take out different samples.
Is there some reason why you don't do multiple training test splits?
Computational reasons.
You have plenty of science.
You don't. This takes a lot of
Okay,
computer
so
training.
10 years
Okay, next question. So we got 5 questions live.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a great presentation, first of all. So I've been doing a lot of studies around, doctor and LLM sort of studies. And I think one thing they cited was the verification, right, of source citation. So I'm curious how you guys are thinking about that. And is it a difficult technical challenge to, beyond having a response, actually cite, where you're putting this information from? Because Google has a lot of experience in that,
Yeah, I think we need to do a better job over here. So one obvious thing we can do is generate a response and then see are there any sources that you can refer to that kind of akin to its response to some overlap. Attribution is done that way. And so that's one of the techniques that we're using right now, but that's not perfect. What you want to be able to do is actually retrieve the right information, feed that into the LLM, and then condition its generation itself on that information. And so there are important bottlenecks over here. The quality of the retrieval matters a lot, and the ability of the LLM to then, pass and combine different sources in the right way and then generate the response. That's a very tricky thing to do, but we are focusing more on that aspect where we can improve the quality of the retrieval and do more retrieval augmented LLMs in that sense.
By the way, we are past the hour, so people need to go. That's totally okay. Thank you. If Vivek, can you hang on for a few more questions?
Yeah.
A few online as well. I see from Anita, this is it was kind of Pat brought this up. There was sometimes it was, or Carl, there's disagreement. Sometimes Beth Palm and Clinton didn't have the same answer. Was there a pattern in what they tended to disagree on, or was it random? Is it conservative? Is it more aggressive? Or you can't really tell? It seems random.
Between Medcom and physicians.
Yeah, when they didn't agree on some of those alignment questions.
Yeah, I think it's the physician answers, when they were rated as being like inferior, it was mostly because they were omitting information. So lacking details, or maybe just because the physician thought that's not necessary, whereas I think MedFarm was able to produce a more comprehensive answer because, it's a language model, right? So I think that was maybe one key aspect of the same differences.
Yeah, and then Blackford Milton, I don't know if I get him on, but also just for sake of time and relate, but he's like, okay, this is super cool, but it's like laboratory testing. When can we see like clinical testing? Does this actually affect care? But there's actually a lot of studies we're doing at Stanford along with that. And then a broader meta question that Alvaro brings up, it's basically like, how can people get their hands on this? What is the scope of when can this be used in clinical settings versus research settings? And even if you can't do this, I know those things are coming anyway, then like, when can you send PHI and when can you not? I don't know if you can comment that mind. This is all a dynamic field that we're all.
It's all happening very fast. We're doing research studies with Stanford, with people like you over here. And then I think we're trying to make the models generally available and make it like HIPAA compliant and like supporting PHI with different data scopes. And so all this is happening really fast. And
so maybe not literally right this second, but it's all in the pipeline. In fact, like the hospital has, I think, got MedPalm 2 access like a week ago or something like this, but it's not for research purposes yet. I assume there's a research corridor that's going to open up in time. Although I still haven't figured out how do we deal with PHI in that case.
I do have a few more questions. I'll talk to you offline, but one question that comes to mind immediately. So what is the point of all this evaluation if it's not going to translate to actual clinical practice? Do you think it's actually relevant evaluation that you did with for example, MedQA? Is it actually useful? I guess.
Well, I mean, no one's going to bother trying the clinical thing before you do that, but sure. What's your thought about that? You've done the MedQA, you're doing all this offline stuff, but how do you make that leap towards, how do you get a doctor or patient to actually use it?
I guess my point is all the financial resources that went into building these bigger and bigger models, is it actually worth it?
of course it is.
So, but then how do you measure that for actual clinical practice, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that comes with, doing proper studies with people who have the expertise, like people like Johan and others. And so you need to do this in control settings with proper RCTs and beyond, and assess, like put metrics around it, then assess it and see what can you up level the standard of care? Can you like augment a physician when they're providing and delivering care? Can you improve the quality of medical information that is being developed to delivered to people? With these
And you
systems?
said that's been going on.
That is ongoing, yeah. But we don't. If you have not properly assessed these systems, and this is hard work. There's evaluation. Doing this takes a lot of time. Like there have been established processes for many years in medical technology and medical device and other things that we can borrow on. But you can't just openly put out a system without any without any proper testing. And so that is what we are focused on doing. But as soon as we become confident about a system and its abilities, and we can characterize the system well, we'll make it available. So that's what we're doing with MedCom 2 and with the future visions as well.
That didn't stop ChatGPT from just going out there, and now everybody's just using for medical advice right now. I don't know. Let's squeeze in a question here, and then we'll start to wrap up.
I have another question about evaluation. So I feel like we've been talking about clinical care almost like a black box in terms of having like an AI doctor, but typically like in RCTs, you have like a question and it's very specific. And like, for example, cardiology or rheumatology or like, so for the clinicians that you're talking to, are you also like looking at various specialties or like confidence levels for various like levels of questions? And
yeah, we are doing that. So the assessments are, a lot of them are based on specialty as well. And so that allows us, okay, maybe in this one, we need more training data, or maybe we need more expert demonstrations if you were to use them in practice in some of the settings. And so that is a part of the process over here.
so then like, are you doing like multiple RCTs then in the future?
I wouldn't say like RCTs for all of them, but you can evaluate all of them right retrospectively. And so at least that's what we are doing. And then there are areas where we think there's a lot of need. Right now, there we progress more towards RCTs or real world studies.
Thank you.
Yes, like obviously a lot more we can discuss. I hope this won't be the last conversation. I hope people will be able to reach out to you individually because there's more questions. We're just out of time now. And thank you again so much again, Vivek, for Thanks, everybody. Catch you next week.